I only remember the following morning finding myself outside of my body and saw myself lying in a rebuilt car, a Peugeot. This Peugeot had been modified into a pickup truck, and I felt fine. Well, I had a feeling that down there was my body, while I floated a small distance above it, and had a sensation of moving further towards the light. And that light became brighter and brighter.
Miss Jolowicz, at the age of 22 and while staying in Ethiopia, you had a near-death experience after having contracted a malaria infection. What exactly happened? How did you experience all this?
Back then, we lived on a construction site in Ethiopia. My husband is a building engineer and was in road building at that time. On that particular day, I wasn't feeling well around noon. And when an Ethiopian staff member arrived, I asked him to tell my husband, which he kindly did. I can't remember my husband appearing on site, and I don't have a recollection of any of that night. The camp's doctor was on leave, so the workers on site decided at 6 the following morning that I must be taken to a doctor, in a car which was followed by other cars, among other reasons on account of poor road conditions. They planned to take me to a Norwegian mission camp, so they prepared for the departure that night. My husband tells me that I looked as if I had already died that night. I only remember the following morning finding myself outside of my body and saw myself lying in a rebuilt car, a Peugeot. This Peugeot had been modified into a pickup truck, and I felt fine. Well, I had a feeling that down there was my body, while I floated a small distance above it, and had a sensation of moving further towards the light. And that light became brighter and brighter. I found myself in the process of dissolving. There was a light that was so ineffable that it's hard to find words for it. And then I became a part of this light. And to me it appeared as if there was no longer a distinction between me and you. There was no sense of touch either. I didn't exist any longer. I never know how to phrase this, but I simply didn't exist anymore. And it was like blending with something. Something you might either call God, or perhaps a nothingness. That was the state of my being at that moment. I was no more. It was indescribable. And the next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes, and I found myself sitting upright in the hospital bed.
And how did you experience your rescue, finding your way back to your earthly existence?
For me it was, well, I was speechless, stunned, and it was simply horrible. It was simply a state of shock. I didn't have this sensation of being inside myself, the sensation of being in my body. And I also no longer have any recollection of the nurses or the doctor. For me, there was simply this strong bewilderment. And it took me quite some time to realize that I was very, very angry at my husband for saving my life. This was very intense.
What was your perception of time? Probably very different from what it's usually like.
Time didn't exist. Time didn't exist at all. I think that's the hard part about describing something that we can't find words for at all.
Surely you later heard reports about what happened from the perspective of the group. In retrospect, how did you experience these moments from your earthly vantage point?
From a strictly chronological perspective, the cars left at 6 in the morning, and due to poor road conditions, we didn't arrive at the mission camp until 11. The doctor in charge immediately realized what had to be done, but I had no sense of time, no.
Your husband will have experienced time in a way much different from yours. He was in fear for your life. First of all, it was necessary to establish whether it was a case of infection. Did you ever reconcile your own experiences with how your husband perceived all this later on, in any way?
I discussed all this in depth with my husband, and we both took written notes of our own perceptions of the events. And he experienced it as catastrophic. My husband is a man who actively takes charge. And for him, first sorting out what needed to happen and what could be done was top priority. That night was a disaster for him, because he had no way of taking action. It was also extremely important that caterpillars were placed alongside the curb of the road, because the road was very muddy due to the monsoon season. And that was his way of responding to his need to take action, so that we'd arrive safely at the hospital. He keeps telling me that I looked more dead than alive. All this, for him, it felt as if he was absolutely helpless. And the moment we arrived at the mission, he immediately approached the doctor and gave an account of the symptoms. The doctor then dropped everything else and prepared an injection. There were no preceding physical examinations or anything else. The doctor recognized very quickly that this was a case of malaria tropica, and for my husband, this basically continued the helplessness. It was hard on him. We later went home in a trotro. That's a type of local passenger vehicle, and since we were European, we were permitted to sit in the front. And the brakes were broken. And the roads were in a mountainous area. My husband was sitting next to me and getting paler by the minute. He clenched his hands harder and harder, and I couldn't help but wonder what was wrong with him, because if anywhere, we were simply going into the light. So these were the different realms of perception we both were in during these moments. It was not until much later that our perceptions would align again.
Did you subsequently share with him what you went through and in what way you perceived all this?
Not until a lot later. We both participated in a large number of self-awareness groups. And we went through a mutual process of self-evolution, which was very precious to us. And because of this, my processing of my near-death experience then became significant to him. And to me, he was someone I could firmly depend on. I could never have made it through this and evolved in the way that I did if it weren't for my husband. He really supported me in every way.
Did you share this with him prior to learning about near-death experiences in general, or not until after the fact?
It wasn't until afterwards. We hadn't previously. He knew me as a highly sentient and sensitive person in general, and he accepted me in my authentic nature. It wasn't until the 1990s that I realized that I had gone through a near-death experience. And in the context of these self-awareness groups that I had participated in, where we applied Stanislaw Grof's methods and a number of other things, things changed. I then had an experience that I had, early on as an infant, gone through an out-of-body experience. I'd already been hospitalized in the first weeks of my life, and I had a perception of myself up there in a corner, and beneath me were all these infants, lying in baby beds, behind a pane of glass. And these were all things where my husband and I grew closer, and in experiencing these things, we had an opportunity to mutually be there for each other.
From your perspective, what opportunities do you see for handling such a trauma in a personally meaningful way?
At first I had no major awareness of all this because of a lot of other events in Ethiopia. These events had occurred right afterwards, and they were also fairly significant. For instance, we were in a car crash. There was a landslide which almost buried other people. So a lot happened. And for me, this experience remained dormant for a long time. And because of the fact that I had developed this hypersensitivity, that I had watches stop working after 6 months due to this, I embarked on this process of self-awareness. Later, we were also in Ghana, so I had no real access to TV or literature. And it wasn't until the 1990s that we had our first computer. Only then did I realise that I had had a near-death experience. And this was a huge relief for me. Just to know and to experience that this was nothing out of the ordinary. On the contrary, that there were a lot of people who had also gone through this experience. But at that time, there was limited communication of these near-death experiences. It was then that we moved again. We did a lot of moving about. When I had settled down a bit more, and the kids had grown up and left home, I devoted a lot of my time to the subject of near-death experiences again. And during that time, I often didn't feel seen. I didn't feel accepted. I even felt rejected. And I was later given a great opportunity. I'd previously taught yoga for a long time, so there was a space available, and I then asked the lady in charge whether I could start a group for people who have had a near-death experience. And this lady then arranged with her superior that it would be okay to start a group for people who had had near-death experiences. This then was my first encounter with the Near-Death Experience Network. I had talked to Mr. Servati, and he supported and reassured me on this. And I went to Lake Constance, because there was a lady who had also started a group with Professor Ewald. For me, this was just wonderful. It was heaven to encounter someone who had also had this experience. It was simply a gift, a priceless gift. Mrs. Pfeiffer had invited 3 more people. And there was this feeling of being seen without the need to explain myself, without needing to elaborate. This was simply unbelievable. This was a great gift.
That means your near-death experience transformed you in a sustained way, but it had remained on the distant sidelines of your life. In your conversations with other near-death experiencers, have you received the impression that many people are affected in this way, and that they simply don't communicate their experiences, and that those remain a side note until they find an opportunity to share this with other near-death experiencers?
I believe that the people who came to these groups, regardless of a larger or lesser context and framework, benefit from it immensely, and that it is very helpful and reassuring for them. And for me, it was very important that there were exclusively participants with a near-death experience. That doesn't mean I'd favour closed groups exclusively by any means. Of course, other people should be given access to support groups as well, because relatives are strongly affected by the life-altering effects of near-death experiences also. So I do think that having open groups is important here, but conversing exclusively with people who have had a near-death experience, that's a totally different thing, because I think this creates a space for many people with near-death experiences. It gives them a safe space that encourages them to communicate their experiences honestly and openly.
Did your experiences have an impact on your relationship?
Back then, I had just got married. My husband didn't know me any different. We hadn't been living together previously. At the time we met, my husband would travel abroad a lot. Since all this happened at the very outset of our relationship, he only knows me in ways I was after my near-death experience. And he was okay with that.
And there were no major changes in your relationship for you?
I can't say. It was too long ago for me to say. And in addition to that, my life circumstances have changed in too many ways compared to then.
What's your take on the matter of death today? Just last but not least, based on your own experiences. What's your position on dying?
I have a very positive perspective on dying, and sometimes an almost too positive one in my own opinion, because I feel this inclination towards the light almost constantly. And for me, this blending into the light is simply wonderful. And I think no one really knows for sure what comes after this. I don't believe in reincarnation, but instead, that's just me though, but instead I rather think that something will occur that exceeds our human capacity for understanding.
From your travels, you became quite familiar with the bulk of African culture. How would you describe their culture as opposed to ours, especially with regard to spirituality?
For me, I feel, particularly in regards to the country of Ghana, and because we were more closely in touch with the local community there, I feel that Africans generally tend to be a lot more spiritual than us, and with a degree of sentience very different from ours. I always felt that they were much more gifted in that regard than we are.
Does this also become apparent in everyday life?
Yes, it becomes apparent in this sincerity, in this closeness to the circle of life. For instance, when our son was born, someone came and said, beaming with joy, "Grandpa is back." So, well, the sentience is remarkable. And it's this acceptance of events that happen in given cycles, and this acceptance of nature, of the way of nature, and of natural occurrences, this acceptance of being part of the whole. It is there that I was under the impression that this is much more apparent in the Ghanaian culture than here, in our European culture. I've always said that if you were to give foreign aid, then we may be doing well from an economic perspective, but from a strictly spiritual perspective, our roles would be exactly reversed.
In your view, how would our culture ideally have to change in dealing with dying, in dealing with death? Where would you start?
For one, I think in terms of a more general sense of appreciation for each other, no matter their provenance or professional training. A higher degree of appreciation. And I would say this acceptance of nature, of life. Let's say an acceptance of nature in general, of the cosmos and all things there. There is no need to fear anything in saying that's nature, dying is a natural process, especially as opposed to us always trying to disregard all this. I think the way in which we deal with death, in a way that depicts death as a dreadful event. When you turn on the evening news, the first thing you'll hear of is a bus accident with 10 casualties. Or there's been a flood, 50 people dead. And these are all scenes of horror which colour death in a negative way. Of course, it is difficult for relatives and dependents to deal with death. There's no doubt about that. But I believe a more positive perspective on death would be more appropriate.
And this including a sense of being closer to truly experiencing life?
That, and I think a life well lived, and lived with joy, enables me to proceed into death with more ease. If in the end I'm able to say, okay, I had a good life, I lived according to my set of values, and it is now okay for me to leave, I think that could be simply wonderful. My mother-in-law said, I can see the light, and now I'm okay with dying. So, you know, I think there are always ways to deal with this. And I also believe this kind of bossing people around and making one's mark often sends us on a path which is too unilateral. No hard feelings, but there are other aspects to life.
Mrs. Jolowicz, many heartfelt thanks for your candour. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences and insights with us. Thanks for this conversation and all the best.